You're listening to Examining Christmas, a Bible study by Jason Lee Willis. I'm just a nerd with the Bible. I have no special talent, training, or certification other than I'm a curious fellow. This podcast you're about to listen to is far from infallible or even professional, but it is my genuine purpose to leave a bit of myself behind. I received a Bible study book my grandfather read, and whenever I'd see something written down or underlined, it thrilled me to be able to peek inside of the man I hardly knew, but walked the same faith path. So this collection of Christmas research is my way to steal the spotlight during a future Willis Christmas with some, "Hey, did you know?" kind of moments. Folks who have attended my Bible studies also know that I seek out the biggest and most epic interpretation I can find. I also do not have a specific denominational slant and have often described myself as a Lutherlicatist, baptized Lutheran, a wannabe Catholic, a dabbler in Baptist, and the can stand for whatever loose hair I have on a certain day. In other words, I'm much more fisherman than Pharisee in my training. I've been accused of pondering things way too long, which is why this study will not be an introduction to the Nativity story, but more of a look outside of the box. I try to study each biblical nugget from a variety of vantages, just to see all the possible meanings. At worst, I hope the study will make you ponder your own interpretations of these awesome verses, granted they're Old King James, or do a little research on your own. Episode 1, The Scarlet Thread. More than 1,000 years before the fate of mankind would be determined in the little town of Bethlehem, two Hebrew men were faced with a decision that potentially doomed mankind. These men were never named in the book of Joshua, but the name of the condemned Canaanite prisoner lived on for thousands of years afterward. While the once mighty city of Jericho burned, and the dying screams of its inhabitants filled the air, the two spies were faced with an ethical conundrum, a paradox of morality. The Canaanites were the arch-enemies of the Hebrews, but not just because they possessed their lands and stood in the way of following the Exodus out of Egypt. The Canaanites had given themselves to the darkness and the foul gods such as Baal, Anath, Molech, and Beelzebub hung on their dying breaths. The promised land had to be purged of this darkness. God had commanded it. On the other hand, the two spies knew the face of the woman who wept at their feet. A short time earlier, she had not only given them shelter, but she had also spared their lives when the king of Jericho came searching for the spies. If not for her, both spies would have certainly been killed. The sword of wrath was set aside. The hand of mercy was extended, and not just to the woman, but to her entire family. Rahab, the prostitute, was spared. So what does a prostitute have to do with Christmas? Everything. This is more than just a lesson about mercy and loving your enemies, neither of which seem to be seen much in the book of Joshua. This is all about understanding a single Canaanite's place in the context of history. As you follow the rest of the story, Joshua and the Hebrews go on to slaughter the enemies of God at an alarming rate. Why? On his deathbed, Joshua explains that allowing these Baal worshippers to survive will only ruin everything he and Moses had fought so hard to acquire. Sure enough, the Hebrews failed to wipe out the Canaanites, and throughout the book of Judges, Kings, and Chronicles, the Hebrews struggle with worshiping these Canaanite gods like a junkie unable to conquer addiction. So why was Rahab spared? First of all, look at her response to the two spies who she hid and protected. Joshua 2:11. And as soon as we heard these things, our hearts did melt, neither did there remain any more courage in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and in earth beneath. Certainly, she was afraid and might have seen this as a get-out-of-jail-free card. But if you look at the second half of her answer, she readily acknowledged God. Did she do this just to save her neck, or did she really repent? Ironically, the mercy of the two spies is not celebrated. 1,000 years later, the author of Hebrews even brings her up between the examples of Moses and the judges. Hebrews 11:31. By faith, the harlot Rahab perished not with them that believed not, when she had received the spies with peace. So it was indeed her faith that saved her, and because of this faith, she helped the spies escape Jericho by lowering them down a rope or cord through a window. Again, what does any of this have to do with Christmas? Perhaps it is best for you to skip to another episode, maybe episode 3, where Matthew, Mark, and Luke will introduce you to Mary and Joseph. But starting there is leaving out so much backstory, including the story of Rahab and her rope. But even Matthew and Luke decided to include long genealogies of Jesus when introducing the story. In those two lists, there is a sea of names that hold a little meaning to most people. At first glance, the basic point of the two lists are to essentially show how Jesus descended from King David, through 2 lines even, as well as descending from good Hebrew stock through Abraham, and even all the way back to Adam. That's nice. Quite impressive, actually. Both Matthew and Luke felt including a genealogy was important, but if you look back at the two lists, they appear to be quite a mess. While Luke starts in the present and goes back through the generations, Matthew began in the past with Abraham and worked his way through the generations to Jesus. Luke uses the phrase "the son of," while Matthew uses the word "begat." Abraham, King David, Joseph. The whole point of showing this lineage as some sort of proof quickly falls apart when you hold the two lists side by side. Let's talk about that for a minute. Who is Jesus' paternal grandfather? Okay, I concede you could shout out that Joseph was not his biological father and that the list, because of this point, is really worthless. But imagine sitting around Nazareth with a young Jesus, and Joseph says to Jesus, "Hey, Jesus, go get my father. Go get Grandpa." According to Matthew 1:16, Jesus should look for Grandpa Jacob. However, if you look at Luke 3:23, Jesus would go get Grandpa Healy. For both Matthew and Luke, this would not have been ancient historical records. Joseph's father would have been known by people still alive. So what gives? I've heard of all sorts of interpretations of the two genealogies. And before I get sucked into these whirlpools, I'll admit that there are all sorts of ways to take this section. Perhaps Healy is just a nickname for Jacob, or perhaps it is another example of countless other biblical figures who have been double named. Jacob is Israel, Saul is Paul, Joseph, Barnabas. I have heard theories that one list is for Joseph and the other list is for Mary. Mary and Joseph might have both belonged to the same tribe, so this is possible. Considering Jesus and Joseph are not biologically related, I can see the importance of showing Mary's line instead of Joseph's. But the number of names is grossly different, seeming to insinuate many extra generations in Luke's account. Another problem is that the lists weave back together with similar names, only to fly apart again. Rahab, you are making a point about Rahab. Early Christians noticed the apparent differences between Matthew and Luke, and an early church historian named Eusebius quoted an older historian by the name of Africanus, who had a very long explanation that I'll quickly sum up so I can get back to Rahab. Africanus explained that there was a difference between the legal line and the biological line. Grandpa Jacob begat Joseph biologically, but legally, Joseph's father was Heli. Complicated, huh? In this regard, it makes sense why the educated physician Luke would have chosen to research and include the legal line of Christ, which includes many more names than the biological line of Matthew. With Luke including the legal son of list, it is not surprising to find some different names. But in Matthew's biological list, there are 4 women included in that list, including, you guessed it, Rahab. Along with Rahab, the other 3 women mentioned have no good reason to be included. After all, 3 of them would be considered sexually immoral women. So why would Matthew make a point to include these 3 women in a genealogy meant to prove the divinity of Jesus Christ? No wholesome Hebrew or Jewish women were even mentioned. Why bother bringing shame to the list? Also, in a list that meant to prove Jesus as the King of the Jews, Matthew included 2 who were considered to be foreigners. And you know the Hebrew marriage policy regarding that. First, let's look at the wife of Uriah, Bathsheba. Interestingly, Matthew does not include her name. Instead, he writes that King David begat Solomon of her that had been the wife of Uriah. Ouch! The Luke lineages focuses on Nathan, the legal son of King David. David's seduction of Bathsheba is told in 2 Samuel 11. David's actions resulted in the murder of Uriah and the eventual demise of his own kingdom after a civil war. But out of this relationship came Solomon, the biological ancestor of, quote, one greater than Solomon, unquote, Jesus of Nazareth. Next, let's learn about a woman who came a few generations prior to Bathsheba, Ruth. Of the 4 names on this list, Ruth is probably the most famous. After all, she has her own book of the Bible in which, what happens in Ruth? The book of Ruth is a story of loyalty and friendship in which Ruth stays by the side of her mother-in-law through all sorts of hardships. According to Mosaic law, Deuteronomy 25, 7-9, when your brother dies, you have an obligation to marry his childless widow. Remember the whole Heli and Jacob situation? Ruth's husband died, leaving her without a child. Later in the story, another Hebrew man, Boaz, fell in love with Ruth. However, according to Mosaic law, another of her former husband's relatives had a better claim. In the end, true love triumphed and Boaz and Ruth got married, allowing Ruth to become the great-grandmother of King David. So, the 2 strangest things about this story is how Mosaic law was set aside and how a Moabite woman was able to marry into the genealogy. Just like the Canaanites, the Moabites were considered to be the enemies of the Hebrew people. To the Hebrews, the Moabites were redneck inbred, seriously, read about Lot, hillbillies. Yes, they even lived in the mountains, who frequently caused problems through the generations. Again, Matthew's decision to emphasize Ruth is beginning to form some sort of point, isn't it? Before Ruth and Bathsheba, there was a woman named Tamar. If you're not familiar with Tamar, you probably just had a bashful Sunday school teacher. Genesis 38 is a bit awkward. One of the reasons Tamar is not well known is that it is sandwiched by the story of Joseph. Despite Joseph being the most beloved of the 12 sons of Jacob, we know Jesus is descended through the line of Judah, the fourth-born son. Previously, we already saw how being the firstborn son, Esau, did not mean you inherit everything of value, Jacob being part of the Christ bloodline. Yet, Genesis 38 had a very strange twist. To begin with, Judah had some impulse problems that resulted in him marrying a Canaanite woman named Shua. And this is before Rahab and Joshua, who gave him 3 sons, Onan, and Shelah. Jacob then arranged a marriage between and Tamar, from the list. However, ended up dying without giving Tamar any children. Again, see Deuteronomy 25. To make things right, Jacob gave Tamar to his other son, Onan, so that they might give dead a legal son. The Luke genealogy, despite the fact that he was dead. Strange, huh? Now, it gets stranger. Onan didn't want to give his dead brother an heir by impregnating poor Tamar. So Onan did something most Sunday school teachers really don't want to discuss. Onan's defiance resulted in a very short life, leaving Tamar as a widow again. According to the Deuteronomy law, Tamar was still owed a husband, but Judah's third son, Shelah, was still a boy. So Judah sent her away until he grew up. A few years passed. Having forgotten his pledge to Tamar, Judah happens to be near Tamar's home when she hears Shelah is of age. She dresses up like a widow and sits on a corner. After working in the fields, Judah sees a woman sitting beside the road and assumes she was a prostitute, which was a big mistake. Tamar keeps her true identity hidden, allows Judah to take advantage of her, and gets impregnated by her father-in-law. Now, ready for the hypocrisy? When Judah learns that Tamar is pregnant, instead of saving herself for Shelah, he decides to burn her for being a harlot. Luckily, she had proof of the father's identity, who turned out to be Judah. So, Judah spares her life, and thus Matthew lists the 2 sons, Phares and Zara, to be listed as Judah's sons, bypassing poor Shelah. During the birth of the twins, a strange phenomenon happens with one of the boys' emerging breech. The nurse quickly puts a scarlet cord around the child's hand to determine who was born first. Like that really mattered? It is this scarlet thread that really caught my attention. Scarlet is the color of blood. A thread is also a line. Bloodline. Look again at the story of Rahab. Remember how she saved the spies who then spared her life? After helping them escape with a rope, they promised to spare her life if she tied a scarlet line in her window. You can read about this in Joshua 2:21. What are the odds of the phrase scarlet line and scarlet thread both being used with the matriarchs in the bloodline of Christ? Neither woman should have naturally been part of the genealogy of Jesus. Rahab was the enemy, for crying out loud. Tamar should have been Shelah's wife, or Onan's, or Er's. Yet the bloodline weaves its way through these two women. And this also makes sense for the other two women in the list. Both Bathsheba and Ruth were widowers involved in scandals. So why did Matthew insist on naming these four women in a list that is trying to establish Jesus' divine rights as King of the Jews? The scarlet thread shows that we, murderers, foreigners, liars, fourth-born sons, adulterers, all had a part in the story. The genealogy of Christ wasn't neat and simple, was it? It also shows that salvation wasn't just for the Jews. Moabite and Canaanite women were featured prominently to show that the Christ was more than just a Messiah for the descendants of Abraham. And the metaphor of a scarlet thread illustrates how this bloodline not only connects to the past, but also our future. As I argued earlier, I'm not even sure if Matthew's list makes biological sense. It is Joseph's list, right? So maybe this bloodline is not about Christ, but about us. We are the scarlet thread. Matthew 27:28 describes how a scarlet robe was put on Christ at the crucifixion, along with the crown of thorns. Christ literally carried our sins, these scarlet threads, to the cross. And how does Christ return? Revelation 9:13 describes Christ will ride on a white horse with eyes blazing like fire and royal crowns upon his head. But what is he wearing? He is wearing a robe that is the color of blood, scarlet. If this metaphor works, he is wearing humanity upon his shoulders as a conquering champion, which is what the Jews were expecting in the first century. But as we learned with Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba, even the concept of the Christ did not go according to a man's definition. You've been listening to Jason Lee Willis's podcast series, Examining Christmas. The music you've heard is from YouTube's audio library. I hope you can join me again for episode 2, What to Expect When You're Expecting the Christ. Until we meet again,